Welcome to MMA Below the Surface, where we break down upcoming UFC cards and combat sports events. I'm your host, Maveen Ahluwalia, and today we're looking at the top 3 fights on UFC 271. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first fight of the night that we're taking a look at is the middleweight bout, Derrick Brunson versus Cannonier. A fight that I'm really excited for and could possibly be lining up the next contender in the middleweight division. Let's start with Brunson first. Some of his strengths, very well-rounded, powerful, great wrestler, and in his last 5 fights has really started putting everything together in his game. I think the switch in time over at Henry Hoof's gym has really brought out the depth in his game, and he's been much more patient and kind of dialed back that intensity that he had in his first couple fights where he used to get a little too wild, and he's really dialed it back but learned to control it in bursts, and it's brought out a whole new depth in his game, and I think it's really what's led him to this upcoming win streak that he's been on. And he's always had those skills, but it's really the patience that I've seen in his last couple fights that has really set him apart and what's allowed him to develop this win streak. Other than that, he's got solid fundamental striking. Like I mentioned, very powerful, very explosive. Last couple fights, like I mentioned, he's been staying very calm. But I think his real weakness is on the defensive end, on the striking aspect. I mean, in wrestling aspect, he's been very good. We've never really seen him ever controlled and really manhandled on the ground. His game's solid there. I think where we've always seen him get in trouble is defensively on the feet. Sometimes he overcommits on shots and he puts himself in positions to get hit and is not always defensively responsible. And I think that's been Derrick Brunson's main weakness, along with him overcommitting to strikes. But like I mentioned, that is something he's dialed back. So a really much improved fighter in Brunson coming into this match. Now, for his opponent, Cannonier, the Killer Gorilla. I am a huge fan of Cannonier, and I think in the middleweight division, besides Robert and Israel, I think he beats everyone else in this division. And I'm actually picking him in this fight by KO. But let me explain some of his strengths. Hugely explosive striker, and is much more technical than people give him credit for. Really sets up his strikes well. He loves to use the calf kick because the power that this guy throws with, he only needs 2 of those calf kicks to land before your leg is done. Sets up with a jab well. Good fundamental striking, but is crazy fast, and all it takes is one shot with him. But I think the really big thing in this fight for Cannonier is his takedown defense. And so far at the middleweight division, it has been pretty much lights out. If people have gone into the ground, it hasn't been for long. And he's been able to work his way back to the feet every single time. And I think for that reason is really what is going to allow him to take this fight over. I think Derrick Brunson, although he's developed this much more patient game, and we've seen him start to hurt people on the feet a little bit more than with just crazy haymakers, but with actually technical striking. Although he's made those improvements, we don't really see Derrick Brunson win if he can't get the takedown. And I think that's the big part in this fight. He's not going to be able to get the takedown on Cannonier. I don't see it happening. By all means, we could go out there and he could show wrestling level that we haven't seen yet in this division. But I think with the caliber of wrestlers that Cannonier's gone against, I think even Jack Hermanson, while not the best wrestler ever, a much more physically opposing threat than Brunson. I think he's a little bit bigger. But even then, just the rest of the Cannonier's resume, I think, sets him apart in the takedown defense-wise. And I think Brunson's not going to be able to get him down. And I think he's actually going to gas himself out trying to out-wrestle Jared, and Jared's going to find the shot and put him away. I'm predicting a 2nd or 3rd round KO for Cannonier here. And I'm really big on Cannonier, and I think, like I mentioned, besides Izzy and Rob, I don't see anybody else in the division that's really gonna. I think he'll have some hard fights, especially with like a guy like Vittori. But I think he could even take on a guy like Vittori, and that might be a great final contenders match after this if the winner doesn't fight for the title right away. But that takes us on to our second fight, second main fight on the main card. So the heavyweight bout, Tuivasa versus Derrick Lewis. This is a really fun fight. I think the Brunson Cannonier fight is much more important for the division, but I think this Tuivasa Bam Bam versus the Black Beast is just a crowd pleaser. I mean, both brawlers, both heavy-handed knockout strikers. Both guys love to go for the finish. On Tuivasa's side, I think he's got, I don't want to say a more well-rounded game, but I think his kicking game is a little bit more polished than Lewis's. You see him really chop the legs a lot more, especially in his last couple fights. He's another guy that's really cleaned up his striking. I know he had a few skids, a few losses, and really took away from that and has looked much better since, much more composed. Even took out Augusto Sakai in one of his last bouts, which a lot of people were really high on Augusto Sakai, very technical heavyweight, and he really put him away. And it wasn't just brawling. It was he set it up with the low kicks, pressured him, wait till he had him cut off in the fence, and then unloaded with the power. And we've really seen that development in his game, and much improved fighter. But I think leg kicks are going to be crucial for him in this fight. Now on to his opponent, Derrick Lewis, the Black Beast. I think everyone loves to watch this guy fight, but I'm a huge fan. I mean, both of these guys, but Lewis a little bit more for me, I will say. But power advantage for Lewis. I think explosivity advantages for Lewis. I think Tuivasa has the better combinations and output, but in terms of one punch power and strength advantage, I think Lewis has that over most of the heavyweight division. I mean, you see even his get-ups, like you see him just stand up sometimes when he wants to. He'll be in bottom half guard, one of the most dominant wrestling positions, and for the guy on top, and he'll just stand up like it's nothing. So just unreal strength. I could see Lewis actually maybe even try to catch one of Tuivasa's kicks and maybe even take him down. It's not a strategy that we've seen from Lewis, but I think if the opportunity presents himself, I think he will take Ty down because his ground and pound is absolutely vicious as well. But Lewis's bread and butter, get the opponent backed up onto the fence and unload those heavy shots, and almost no one in that division can take those from him. I mean, most knockouts in heavyweight history, which is just crazy. I mean, you don't have Knockout King tattooed on your chest for no reason. Now, in terms of who I think, based on that, is going to win this fight, this one is really a coin flip. I think the way these guys fight, it could go either way. But I'm slightly favoring Lewis in this, and I'll give you a few reasons why. I think this comes down to whoever can take the center of the octagon. Both these guys aren't great backing up, but Lewis has shown an ability to land those knockout shots while he's baiting an opponent in. And I think while both of them have the strengths and both of them favor their strengths when they're moving forward and when they have the center, I think the fact that Lewis can back up and still land shots gives him an extra advantage in this fight, because I doubt one person will have the control the entire time. I think there will be a little bit of gamesmanship there, and it will be a fight for who gets center. But just the fact that Lewis has that ability, I think automatically gives him an edge. And I think the power advantage as well is a big thing. I think if they do get into a brawl and they're just going shot for shot, I think Lewis has a little bit of a better chin and will land the harder shot, absolutely. So just from an absolute brawl perspective, I would take Lewis. But just because Lewis has a little bit more of an ability to strike while backing up as well as forward than Ty does, I would favor Lewis. But I think when you're looking at this fight, I think key thing here is to see who's taking the center of the octagon more. I think whoever is controlling the distance and controlling that center and is able to back the opponent up is the person who's going to win this fight, because both these guys do their best work when they have their opponent backed up against the cage. But that's my pick for the heavyweight fight, and I know it's going to be an amazing one. Now, that brings us to our main event. Israel Adesanya versus Robert Whittaker, 2 for the middleweight championship. I mean, this is a fight I have been very, very excited for. And I honestly think these two guys are pound for pounds in the UFC. I think they're one of the best. They're both some of the best and should both be on the pound for pound list, in my opinion. Where to start? Let's start with Robert. So Robert Whittaker, he's shown huge improvements in his last couple fights. I know a lot of people have been saying, I've heard some comments saying that those 3 wins haven't been that impressive. Maybe Jared hurt him a little bit in his fight. I mean, did get rocked a little bit in the Darren Till fight, but to me, he's shown a much more patient game and a much more well-rounded game. And I think those are 2 things that's going to serve him much better in the next Israel Adesanya fight, against his fight with Izzy. And I think if you look at their first fight, what was his mistake? It was overcommitting, and then when getting caught, just trying to launch himself into the fire and go to war. And you've seen in all of Izzy's fights, Izzy does with what you give him. I mean, if you come at him, that's his bread and butter. He's a counter striker. It's gonna look like an amazing fight. But if you stay there and just kind of try to play that counter striking game, and I think what I'm trying to convey, like the Yoel Romero fight is the perfect example. Yoel didn't once overcommit. Yoel tried to stay right in front of him and counter strike him the same way. And people underrate Yoel's counter striking game. He's a very good counter striker. But when you saw those both of them meet, it was a really boring fight and barely anything happened. But when you see a guy like Robert in their first fight launch himself, try to close the distance with these explosive blitzes, it plays perfectly into Izzy's counter-striking game. And you see that Izzy's fights kind of match how his opponent is coming at him. If his opponent has a measured approach, he usually fights at a measured pace. If his opponent's mixing up takedowns and there's a threat there, he'll be a little bit more conservative. You don't see him sit down on those punches as much. If there's fights like Calvin Gastelum and this Robert Whittaker fight where they just try to go to war with him on the feet, you see this explosive counter-striking ability where Izzy's finishing these dudes or at least dropping them multiple times. And I think it's really going to come down to Robert making that game plan switch and fighting a much more composed fight. I'm sure he's seen things from the Vettori fight and the Jan Blachowicz fight that are going to be in favor of him. And I'm sure Izzy's seen things on his end as well. But I think really slowing down that pace and allowing Robert to kind of use his full breadth of skills is going to be really important here. But again, not launching himself in, not trying to fight a high-paced fight, because the more he's in the pocket with Israel, the more chances he's going to leave himself to get knocked out. And I think that's a really big component to this fight. I think Robert's got to play the leg kicking game with him, just as Jan did. Play the kickboxing on the outside, but leave that threat of the takedown there, establish it. I think if Robert can't get Israel down in this fight, I have a hard time seeing him win. I don't even think he really needs to control him. I really just think he needs to just establish that a credible threat. I think if he can hold him down for a few minutes in maybe 1 or 2 rounds, that threat will be enough where his stand-up will become so much better against Israel. But if it's just a straight kickboxing match, I don't see any way Robert Whittaker can win this fight. Now, for Izzy, I think Izzy's fights have prepared him really well for this. I think the fights with Vettori and Jan, even though that was a loss, they really, you really saw his wrestling improvements, especially in the second Vettori fight. I mean, Vettori could not take him down or keep him down at all. And Vettori is a strong wrestler, man. I'm very impressed with Vettori's wrestling, especially in the Hermansson fight. You just saw him completely dominate the wrestling exchanges there and actually reverse Hermansson multiple times. I'm very high on Vettori's wrestling, and I think the fact that Israel was able to stuff all those is a big indicator of how his takedown defense, and not only that, just his wrestling game in general, has greatly improved. I think the one thing that Robert has that Vettori doesn't is the explosive timing. You've seen him use it, especially in the Calvin Gastelum fight when him and Calvin fought. They would get into these striking exchanges and Robert would slip under and get double unders and just toss him. Because, I mean, Robert's a freaking tank. But I think the timing of the takedowns is what's going to be key. And that's what actually got Izzy in the Jan fight, was the timing of the takedowns were unexpected and they were in the open mat. What Vettori kept trying to do was wrestle against the fence, and I think for any long, lanky guys, wrestling against the fence is so much easier. But if you can if you can time that takedown in the center, that is what is going to be key for Rob, and that's what's really going to be Izzy's weakness in this fight. Because I think if it's a striking fight, I mean, yes, Israel has to train, yes, he has to prepare, but I mean, that's what he's been doing his entire career. That's his background. That's nothing to him, but it's going to be the timing of Robert's takedowns. And if you don't see Robert establish that, I think at least once within the first 3 rounds, I think it's going to be a long night for him. I don't see this being a finish again. I see this being a 5-round war, but I do see Izzy coming on top if he cannot establish that takedown. So I think that's the main thing to look out for in that fight. I don't think it's as simple as that. I'm not saying Robert can't hurt him on the feet, but I think he needs to establish that threat in order to open up the striking. And I don't think he needs to win the fight just ground and pounding, but he needs that threat there in order to be able to open up the full depth of his skills. Otherwise, it's an easy night for Israel Adesanya, and we'll see and still. And that's it for the main card. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Like and subscribe, and as always, enjoy the fights.